Revolutions look sudden. One week the regime is unshakable, the next week it's on television signing its own death certificate. But history is lying to you. None of this is sudden. 1917 wasn't sudden, 1989 wasn't sudden. Both were the final payment on a bill that had been compounding for decades, a bill called governance debt. Today, we're going to connect three moments: 1917, 1989, and the one nobody wants to name yet, the next turn of the cycle. Not as isolated crises, but as points on a single curve. A revolution cycle that activates whenever a state tries to defy economic reality and silence political feedback for too long. The Russian Empire didn't fall because of one bad winter. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because of one bad general secretary. Both systems imploded for the same structural reason. They had spent decades borrowing from the future, trading real reform for propaganda, trading honest feedback for flattery. Their governance debt finally defaulted. And here's the part people don't like. The pattern didn't die in 1989. It migrated into our world, into our institutions, into a global system that is once again drowning in death, narrative management, and policy paralysis. This is not just history. This is a live risk model for today's over-leveraged, digitally managed global order. And if 1917 was the first turn, and 1989 was the second turn, then the obvious question is what happens on the third turn? And how close are we?
To understand the revolution cycle, you don't start with riots. You start with a system that looks strong on paper. The Tsarist Empire controlled 1/6 the world's land. The Soviet Union commanded a nuclear arsenal, a space program, and an army of planners who claimed to have solved capitalism's crises. Both looked formidable. Both were already failing. Underneath the impressive statistics, both regimes shared the same mathematical flaw in their design. It wasn't just corruption or bad leaders or bad luck. It was a structural decision. Centralize power, suppress feedback, and punish anyone who points out that the numbers don't add up. That decision creates governance debt. Every falsified report, every delayed reform, every silenced expert is a new line item on the liability side of the state's balance sheet. Just like financial debt, governance debt accrues interest. The more reality is suppressed, the more dangerous it becomes to admit the truth. In both systems, the same pattern emerges. First, policy paralysis. The leadership knows the model isn't working, but any serious reform threatens their own position. Second, narrative capture. Statistics and speeches replace reality. Third, rising sovereign risk. The regime must spend more and more money, fear, and ideology just to stand still. At this point, collapse is a timing problem, not a possibility problem. The system is already insolvent in government's terms. All it needs is a trigger, a war, a financial crisis, a shock it can no longer paper over. That's when the revolution cycle flips, from silent decay to visible implosion.
Our first case study, 1917. The moment the Russian Empire's governance debt finally came due. By the early 1900s, the Russian Empire looks like it is finally catching up. Railways spread across the map. Heavy industry rises in St. Petersburg and Moscow. Foreign capital pours into mines, mills, and railroads. To outside observers, this is late but real modernization. Inside the system, the picture is different. Millions of peasants remain locked into an unresolved land question. A rapidly growing urban working class has no real political channel. After the 1905 revolution, the Tsar creates parliament, the Duma, and then neutralizes it. Reform exists on paper, but not in power. This is how governance debt builds. Each time the regime promises reform and then blocks it, it borrows from the future. Each time it suppresses dissent instead of integrating it, it trades short-term calm for long-term volatility. The imperial state becomes addicted to the myth that change can always be postponed without consequence. In 1914, the interest rate on that governance debt spikes. World War I turns every structural weakness into an existential threat. The railways buckle under military supply demands. Food shortages turn from chronic to catastrophic. Soldiers at the front learn that their families are starving, their officers are incompetent, and their sacrifices may be meaningless. The Tsarist regime responds like late-stage systems always do, by narrowing the circle. Bad news is punished, not fixed. Advisors are chosen for loyalty, not competence. Reality becomes subversive. Policy becomes theater. Governance degenerates into a ritual of pretending that the plan is working.
By early 1917, the imperial state is effectively bankrupt in governance terms. Inflation is destroying wages, transport is collapsing, the army is disillusioned, and the monarchy's symbolic capital its myth of divine, timeless authority is burned down to embers. The state cannot deliver basic obligations, food, security, a believable future. When protests begin in Petrograd, they are not yet a revolution. They are a demand for bread and competence. But the regime has no credibility left. Its promises are worthless IOUs. It has already defaulted in the eyes of its own population. That's why protest morphs into a revolution with astonishing speed. The Bolsheviks don't seize a robust state. They walk into a vacuum. The old institutions, monarchy, bureaucracy, army command, were so discredited, so hollowed out, that relatively small groups can capture them. That is what a revolution really is. Not just the presence of radicals, but the absence of institutional resilience. 1917 wasn't a freak accident that interrupted reform. It was the default outcome of reform postponed for too long. Incremental corrections were blocked. Feedback loops were closed. The only adjustment left was catastrophic. Pause and map this onto your own world. Where do you see governments buying time with slogans instead of solutions? Where do you see critical systems, pensions, healthcare, infrastructure, kept alive with subsidies and spin instead of structural repair? Those are not just political debates. Those are entries on a governance debt ledger.
Our second case study, 1989. Different ideology, same cycle. The Soviet Union in the 1970s looks stable from a distance. It's a superpower. It has nuclear parity with the United States. It put the first human in space. It claims to have solved unemployment, poverty, and capitalist crisis through scientific planning. On May Day, tanks and missiles roll perfectly past their viewing stand. Beneath the spectacle, the same systemic failure was quietly compounding. Gosplan replaces market prices with targets, but targets don't report reality, they report what the center wants to see. Enterprises lie and meet them. Managers fake productivity. Entire ministries operate inside an ecosystem of carefully curated falsehoods. Once again, governance debt builds. Chronic shortages of consumer goods are hidden under glowing production reports. Environmental disasters are buried under ideological slogans. Ordinary people live in a world where the official newspaper described prosperity and the grocery store described something else entirely. The 1970s oil boom buys the system time. High oil prices bring in hard currency. The state can afford to import grain, technology, and some consumer goods. It can keep servicing its governance debt. But nothing fundamental is fixed. The mathematical flaw in the planned economy remains. No honest feedback, no real prices, no reliable mechanism for organic correction. By the 1980s, the bill is due again. Growth stalls. Technological lag becomes obvious. Military commitment from Eastern Europe to Afghanistan bleed resources. The Soviet Union is a superpower still acting as if it's on the rise, when the numbers say decline. Gorbachev tries something no czar could have imagined: partial honesty. Perestroika and glasnost, restructuring and openness, are attempts to recognize the governance debt and restructure it before collapse. But once you admit that the statistics have been lies, you don't just fix a spreadsheet, you detonate the regime's narrative of competence.
When Soviet citizens learn the real cost of Chernobyl, the real casualties of Afghanistan, the real state of their economy, they don't simply update their opinions. They realize they've been living inside a managed illusion. The gap between narrative and reality becomes unbridgeable. By 1989, the Soviet system is in the same late-stage position as the Tsarist regime. Trapped between repression it can no longer fully afford and reforms it cannot fully survive. This is classic policy paralysis, oscillation instead of strategy. The center hesitates, the periphery moves. When the Berlin Wall falls, it looks like a miracle. It is not. It is the visible phase transition of a system whose sovereign risk has been rising for years. Eastern European regimes, backed by a weakening Moscow, are governance zombies. Technically in control, practically insolvent. The Soviet Union itself disintegrates not because one man mishandled one crisis, but because the institutions were designed for control, not correction. Now, bring this forward. Today's global system is not Tsarist autocracy and not Soviet central planning. It is something more diffuse and, in some ways, more dangerous. High public and private debt, financial markets that can destabilize entire countries in days, digital infrastructure that can be used either for accountability or for total information control. Instead of Gosplan issuing production quotas, we have central banks setting interest rates, regulators nudging capital flows, and tech platforms curating what millions of people see and say. The tools are different. The temptation is the same. Manage perception instead of reality.
When economies fail to deliver broad prosperity, governments buy time with debt and asset bubbles.
When governance fails, they buy time with PR campaigns, culture wars, and carefully managed narratives. When social cohesion frays, they buy time by redirecting anger at migrants, at foreign enemies, at internal traitors. Each of these is a new entry in the governance debt ledger. No, this does not mean tomorrow will look exactly like Petrograd in 1917 or Berlin in 1989. The third turn of the revolution cycle may be slower, more digital, more fragmented. It might look less like a single explosion and more like a prolonged erosion of trust across many countries and institutions at once. But the logic is the same. When official narratives drift too far from lived reality, trust collapses, and when institutions cannot self-correct, citizens look outside the system for solutions. So ask yourself, with forensic honesty, in your country, can bad policy actually be reversed? Can data be openly challenged without punishment? Can institutions acknowledge deep mistakes and survive? Or is everything structured to preserve the facade at any cost? Let's put the pattern together. In both 1917 and 1989, the system didn't fail when crowds appeared in the streets. It failed years earlier in quiet meetings, falsified reports, and postponed decisions. The revolution is just the moment the invisible bankruptcy becomes visible. The revolution cycle looks like this. First, over-centralization. Power, information, and resources flow upward to a small group. Local knowledge is treated as noise. Second, narrative substitution. Real feedback, crises, protests, elections, and journalism is replaced with curated statistics and controlled media. Third, governance debt accumulation. Each unresolved problem is rolled forward, financed with propaganda, subsidies, and repression. Fourth, a trigger event, war, financial shock, scandal, exposes the gap between story and reality. Finally, trust collapse and systemic reset.
1917 and 1989 are not random tragedies. They are stress tests that the Russian and Soviet systems failed. Why? Because they were built for control, not correction. They maximized short-term order at the cost of long-term institutional resilience. They could not bend, so eventually they broke. A current global order is heading into its own stress test. High leverage, fragile supply chains, aging populations, technological disruption, environmental strain, political systems that struggle to process any change that isn't cosmetic. You don't need ideology to see the risk, you just need a risk model. But the revolutionary cycle is not destiny. There is a way out, and it doesn't start with slogans, it starts with resilience by design. Resilient systems institutionalize feedback. They protect independent courts, investigative media, real local government, and functioning elections as early warning sensors. They prefer frequent, small course corrections over rare, catastrophic failures. They decentralize power and responsibility. They accept that no leader, party, or committee can manage a complex society from the center. They distribute authority so that when one node fails, the whole system doesn't collapse. They normalize admitting error. They treat policy reversals as signs of health, not humiliation. Leaders can say, "We were wrong, we're changing course," without detonating their legitimacy. That is the precise opposite of the Tsarist court and the Soviet Politburo. This is the core lesson. Catastrophic revolutions become inevitable only when systems refuse to fail in small, controlled ways. When you outlaw small failures, you invite one large systemic failure later. That is not ideology, that is basic risk management.
At the macro level, the societies that survive the next century intact will not necessarily be the richest or the loudest. They'll be the ones that can change course without imploding. The ones that design institutional resilience into the system, instead of assuming the system will never be tested. At the micro level, your own resilience matters more than you think. In a world of rising sovereign risk, it is dangerous to assume that the system will always function the way it does today. Skills, savings, diversified networks, and the ability to operate under different regimes are not prepper fantasies. They are rational responses to a world that has defaulted before. 1917 and 1989 are not distant Soviet dramas. They are case studies in what happens when governance debt is allowed to compound unchecked.
Our current order is writing its own balance sheet right now. Every time it chooses narrative over reality, delay over reform, paralysis over adaptation. The only question is whether we learn from those collapses or repeat them in higher definition. On Inside the Soviet Economy, we treat these events not as nostalgia or morality plays, but as hard data about systemic failure, governance, and institutional resilience. If you want to understand where we really are in the revolution cycle and how not to be surprised by a crisis that was mathematically baked in decades ago, this is the lens you need. If you've watched this far, don't leave this as just an interesting video. Think about your own institutions, your own country, your own risk exposure. And if you want to keep decoding these patterns with us, subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with this series. Because the revolution cycle hasn't finished turning. And when the next turn comes, the only real advantage you'll have is having seen it coming.